Hey, and welcome back to the latest installment of the Music History Project. Today, we are very excited to bring you an episode dedicated to the Parnelli Lifetime Achievement Award winner, Bob C. Welcome to the Music History Project. We're your hosts. I'm Elizabeth Dale.
And Dan Del Fiorentino.
And Mike Mullins.
All of our content comes from the Oral History Program, which is sponsored by NAM, the National Association of Music Merchants. And that is a program that is over 3,000 interviews and constantly growing. If you want to check out any of our content or any of the other interviews that aren't featured, please check out our website at www.nam.org/library. All right, we're so excited you guys are joining us today. We have an episode dedicated completely to Bob C., who is
the founder of the C Factory, of course, and the winner of the, as you mentioned earlier, the Parnelli Lifetime Achievement Award. Now, you know, the Parnellis are now located at NAM, which is one of the reasons we are so thrilled to document some of their history, but actually we've been documenting their history for about 20 years now, nearly since the very beginning of the NAM Oral History Program in 2000. So it's really kind of neat to have them officially in the fold of the NAM family.
And their first show, official appearance, I guess you could say, at the NAM show was 2018, right?
That's right.
January
yes.
2018. And you guys got to go.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't. I don't know what I was doing.
I think you were having a baby.
Yeah.
Oh, right. That's what it was.
You're a little preoccupied.
I probably would have rather have been at the Parnellis. Experiences. What did you think? Opinions?
Well, I
Reviews?
love that group. I mean, that group to me always should have been part of the NAM family, and I think it just sort of took the right time and space, basically, to make that happen. These are folks that are primarily our roadies and professional live sound folks in charge of everything from hanging the lights and the audio equipment to making sure the stage is secure. Just a wonderful group of people, and it's been fantastic to document that history.
So we have today's episode is an interview that Dan did with Bob C. of the C Factory, as he mentioned earlier. Is there any, important details or factoids or anything like that you want to give us before we jump into it?
Well, it's really exciting. I mean, to me, one of the key components of documenting the history of the music products industry is that we're sitting down and we're talking to people who were there, right? We weren't there necessarily. They were there, and we get to have sort of that vicarious experience. And to me, nothing illustrates that more, in my opinion, than Bob's experiences. I mean, this guy really was there at the very beginning of what we now refer to as live sound in the live sound industry. He was there before Woodstock and even before the Fillmore, and documented that history and watching it grow and showing us and telling us in this interview the different components, not only just in gear, but in the way people approached it, the way audience expected sound differently as a result of some of their efforts. So being on the cutting edge is one thing, but being there and having a role in that experience and the transition into what we now refer to as live sound is really kind of cool. And he was a heck of a great guy. He was also a student of history and recorded his own set of interviews with people. So he was able to tell us some history based on what he had learned from other people as well. So just a real great experience for me. That took place in 2010, I believe.
So why don't we go ahead and jump into it? And I think Mike should tell us where we're going to start.
Sure. We are going to start off Bob's interview hearing about music for him when he was a child, as well as going to NYU for tech and lighting and working at the Fillmore Theater.
Well, I'm so grateful for your time, and I don't want to take too much of it, but I would love to start with just where your passion for all this came from. Did you have a lot of music and that sort of thing in your house when you were growing up?
When I was growing up, both my parents were musicians, and they were both school teachers. And they taught in the New York City school system, and they taught, my mother taught music, And my father taught music as well as he became a guidance counselor and then became dean of boys at the high school he went to. And my mother used to teach, I think it was 5th grade in Brooklyn, but also taught their string violins, violas, all of the string instruments. And when I was growing up, my sister had to take lessons, and she chose the flute. And because they had such a miserable time with her, they didn't force me to do any instrument, right? But I grew up around Texaco hour on Sundays. If I wanted to go, I couldn't go through the living room for 2 hours as my dad listened to Texaco and go to my bedroom. So you were either up or you were down, and that was it. And eventually I just got, I'd sit on the stairs and listen to it myself and developed, a musical appreciation. And I was always around music all my life, I think my dad would have become a professional musician if it wasn't the mid-30s and he was happy to have a job being a school teacher. So, I went to high school and ended up in the play production group and became a tech. I've been involved with musical stuff since I was 12 years old. And my parents started a musical society up at where we went for summers in Watkins Glen. And they called it the P. Georgia Music Society. And I used to do I sang and I also did the little lighting for them and, make sure the microphones worked and things like that. But out of that, from there, when I was in high school, even in junior high school and elementary school, I was always diddling with record players. And we're talking AM radios back in those days, and put speakers all around my room and have switches. I could turn them on, turn them off, things like, So from there, I ended up going to NYU, School of the Arts Theater Program, which was right next door to the Fillmore East before it opened. And it was a beginning program at NYU. It was actually the School of the Arts, which they had film, television, but I was there for theater major to do tech and lighting, And I guess it was a year and a half. I'd been in school about a year and a half. And all of a sudden, the Fillmore East became alive next door. The theater became alive. We all wondered, what's going on? So we all would wander in and see what was going on. Because before that, they had been doing shows down the street at the, I can't remember the name of it. Was it the Anderson Theater? I think it was the Anderson Theater down on 2nd Avenue. And they got thrown out of there, and somehow they ended up at the theater right next door to the Fillmore, which was on 6th Street, which became the Fillmore, which there was a Lowe's. It was a Lowe's. It was a Lowe's movie theater, and they had a 2,800 seating capacity, I guess. It was a big, big screen of the, in the 50s, 60s, the big screen stuff. So, it had been closed and for a few years, and somehow a group of people, I'm not sure who the initial people were, but Josh would know all of that, Josh White, from the light shop. And so, we heard all this noise next door, and we all kind of wandered in, and it became a place for all of us to work and make extra money while we were going to school. And, it was it was just a whole nother world. We had the opportunity there to do things at the Fillmore. We're working on a real stage house. Well, next door at the School of the Arts, where I went, there wasn't a real stage house, proscenium house per se. We had a module stage that Jules Fisher had designed that the first time we did a major production there, we ended up lifting it up and putting it against the wall because it weighed, 20 tons or whatever it was, right? Because the first design was a basic stage, thrust stage with a proscenium around it. And the school didn't have that, so we created it. So that was the first year, I guess. And then the next year, when the Fillmore was opening up, we all kind of gravitated over there because we had never really worked. None of us really worked in a big theater like that. And, well, I don't know, we all got hooked on the music and got, it was the music of the day. We were listening to, anti-war songs. We'd be listening to rock and roll, with at 3 o'clock in the morning at NYU, when we were doing shows there. So this was wow, we're having all this next door. And we just all got sucked in. And it became, a new livelihood for all of us. Or I think the people that I went to school with, all the 3 or 4 people who were the you know, I don't know what you call it. They weren't the cream of the crop, but they were the cream of the crop in the sense that they did strange things and liked to do different things, and you know, the challenge of it, right, of dealing with rock and roll, because the rock and roll business didn't know the things that we knew in the theater business, and we didn't know some of the things that they knew in the rock and roll business, you know, because they had dealt with sound. I mean, it's just a lot of different things, right? So I just got sucked into it because of the Fillmore, and Bill Graham gave us our head, and we were able to do things that we weren't able to do next door at NYU, and it was a very exciting time. It was, you know, 1967, 68, you know, all the things going on in our country, and the changes of, you know, all of the things from the Democratic Convention in Chicago to, you know, the Martin Luther King down in Washington, you know, I mean, just a lot of things were going on. So the Fillmore became a home, I think, to a bunch of us, because it was there, and Bill was very accepting to what we, you know, wanted to do, and we built our own sound system, and we put in a lighting system, and it was just, you know, we kind of like we didn't have to work our way up a ladder because there was no ladder to climb. We were the ladder, the beginning of the ladder, right? And in those days, no one brought production with them, you know. If you came to the Fillmore, we had like, I guess, 60, 70, 80 lights hanging. This is way before the world of moving lights. And we had Bill had given us money to build our own sound system. So we had our own sound system, and as part of the contracts, I guess, with the artists, they had to use our sound equipment. I think a couple times we ended up having to take our sound gear out because the band wanted to use their stuff, and for whatever reason, they were traveling with it.
So not having had the privilege of traveling to New York City, I know it's on my bucket list, I got to get out there. I had never really heard of the Fillmore, but based on Bob's interview with the pre-production of all this, I take it is a very iconic location, unfortunately not in service anymore, I guess you would say. So background?
Well, the history of it is fantastic. I mean, this is an auditorium, basically, that started with an idea that Bill Graham came up with. Bill Graham was a promoter of concerts and creator of a lot of great concert venues all over the world. In particular, 2. One called the Fillmore Auditorium in San Francisco, which he started, I believe, in 1965. It lasted a few years and became very iconic because mostly of the people that he had performed there, everybody from Jimi Hendrix and the Grateful Dead to the Doors, for example. And it was named for that part of San Francisco called the Fillmore District and became very iconic. And, of course, Bill became very iconic at the same time, Mr. Graham, because of his great influence that he had on all these various bands and artists who became close personal friends of his. I think mostly because it came from a very acceptable place. He wasn't there actually trying to make money. All of his concerts at the very beginning certainly were about the benefits, and he was looking always for causes. A great part of his character was how he was always trying to find somebody he could help. And as a result, he would put a concert on, ask some of his friends to perform, and then donate that money, oftentimes not making money himself. And not to say he was a completely selfish person, but he certainly had that streak that went through all throughout his career. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later, but I think what's really important here is that expanded into Fillmore East, which started in 1968, and also was the perfect venue for a large array of artists from Janis Joplin, Jimi Hendrix, just about everybody performed in the San Francisco and in the New York auditoriums named Fillmore. So what's exciting about that, and going back to Bob C., is that here's a guy who was there and watched all this grow and develop. So I think we're going to hear a little bit more about that coming up. Is that right?
Yeah, we're going to have Bob telling us about what touring was like back in the 60s. Sounds like kind of the evolution of how the Fillmore in New York was kind of a catalyst for change in terms of setting the industry standard for what the whole experience should be like, as well as you're going to hear him reflect on Bill Graham.
But in those days, there wasn't traveling equipment. I mean, people didn't travel with semis and semis of equipment. In those days, if they traveled with a 16 or a 24-foot box truck, that was about all of it, because the band gear would travel on that and maybe a little bit of lighting stuff or whatever. But it was very small, and it was even before the days of people taking tour buses and all that. They would fly, I remember being on tours where I'd get up at 6 a.m. or 5 a.m. and get on a flight from one place to another, at 7 in the morning, and I'd get to the city I had to go to, and the crew call would be at 10, so you get in a cab and go to it was nuts, because you'd finish the show at 3 in the morning, and then the travel agencies would have booked you with something at 6 in the morning with step over in Chicago to get to some, it was just, and people today who go on the road and travel don't realize the luxury they travel in compared to when we started out in. Many times, a lot of stuff in the beginning, I drove the truck that had the lighting gear in it. So it wasn't like I had a truck driver. So, I remember crossing the flats of Kansas and, having been up for 3 or 4 days and looking and seeing pink dinosaurs passing me on the side road. It was, you were so wired, from, you buy coffee cups, they were like 24 ounces of coffee. It wasn't, and, it was just, drugs to help you stay awake weren't really, maybe you took a White Cross now and again because you get them at truck stops or whatever, no-dos or whatever. But, it was just a whole crazy world. And it was very exciting. Every week we had a different band, so it was like presenting a whole new kind of genre of music. And Bill Graham always managed to have a cross-section of artists where he would take one type of music and put somebody else in with something else. And, it was really, he was a brilliant director of producer of how to put different artists together, and the audiences really appreciate it. He'd have the strangest people together. An opening act would be Sha-Na-Na, and they were never heard of at that point, and it would be against the Grateful Dead as the closing act. I'm trying to think of some of the other. He was just brilliant at of his bookings, right?
So I know we're going to be hearing a little bit more about Bill Graham, but just to kind of finish up what we were discussing earlier about his desire to create venues that would benefit a cause. I remember this very distinctly because when I was a kid, I was in San Francisco, and I heard lots of stories about this guy, Bill Graham, and I actually got to meet him once for a radio program that I was doing, and it was just cool. I mean, he was such a neat guy, very sort of nonchalant, and didn't expect anybody to kind of get up out of their chair. But, of course, everybody did because it was Bill Graham, and here's the icon that brought all of these amazing artists to the audiences. And he didn't really kind of put on airs to me at all, and it was a neat experience. Sadly, it was just a couple of weeks later he was killed in a helicopter crash. He went up to a concert where Huey Lewis and the News were performing. He went backstage and he tried to get Mr. Lewis to sign on to do a benefit concert for those who had lost their homes in a wildfire that hit a very large part of Oakland in the San Francisco Bay Area, and Mr. Lewis agreed to do it, and so Bill Graham got back on a helicopter to go back to the Bay Area when it hit some power lines. And I remember hearing the news, and just I could not get over it. I mean, I was still a teenager, so of course that whole thing about, wow, life is so unpredictable. I just met this guy, and here it is, it's all over. But then to see sort of the aftermath of all of that and to hear people coming out in huge numbers to sort of say how important he was to music. And I was really struck by that. And I think really honestly that had something to do with me wanting to continue to document the music history because it is so important. And boy, it sure would have been great to have interviewed him, but I didn't have that chance. But I had the chance to interview others who knew him. So when meeting and interviewing Bob C., I was sure to ask about Bill Graham so that we could have part of that puzzle piece put into this collection and to make sure that his contributions to music would not be overlooked. And that's exactly how I feel about the Bob C. interview. You know, we lost Bob in 2015, and there's so much that has been happening with the Parnellis and the inclusion into the NAMM show and all that I really wish Bob could have been around to see because I know that he would have been excited about that. But still, we have his story, and I'm very honored that we get to share that with you today. So let's continue with that wonderful perspective that he had about the growth and development of live sound. Where are we off to next?
Next up, we're going to hear Bob talking about different gimmicks that shows would ask for, as well as working around and in different venues, concerts in the parks when he was a student and a young adult. And then he was going to talk about Woodstock a little bit and the growth of outdoor concerts.
Just that little outdoor festival.
Just
a little blip in history.
That little
couple
concert.
people went to.
Different artists we did different gags for, like The Crazy World of Arthur Brown. He wanted to come in on a wire and fly onto the stage, but we couldn't do that. So they built a Sudan chair, I think it was, and they carried him on stage. And they had the guys, 4 big security guards, stripped down to their waists, greased down, oiled down, with looking like they were Sultan slaves and stuff. And we did for Halloween. I think it was Frank Zappa. We had the show. I think it's Halloween, and we had a guy who used to be Zachary, who was a big radio guy who. Would talk like Frankenstein. He was like had a very voice, and this is the was accurately and it just was a very I think I built a coffin for him to carry him on stage, tip the coffin up, and then he would walk out of the coffin and then sit back in the coffin, and we'd carry him off, and he introduced the band or whatever it was, and for the Who we built a rake stage and had a giant curved screen behind him. At the light show, and a lot of the ideas came up from whether it be Bill or Kip Cohen or Josh White from the light show, or when Chip was there, he had ideas. Chipmunk, the voice of Woodstock, as he's known as, and John Martz. There are different people out, different visual, and you run them past Bill, and he said, "Oh, that's a great idea. Let's do that. Or let's do this or that." So. It was always something going on, I mean, I used to go to school, and I had like 20 hours of classes, and I go next door and work for 40 hours, at $1.50 or $2 an hour, building the theater when we first started. And a lot of us, after we left school, that's where we ended up, doing shows. And every year, and then we did a thing in concerts in the park where the Parks Department set up one of their winger stages, and we'd do Jefferson Airplane and Silver Cup, and Jefferson Airplane, Grateful Dead, or some other of the bands from San Francisco, and then we'd finish the show at 2 a.m. because we had double shows back to back, on Friday night, and then we go Saturday, or we do actually it was 2 nights, Friday and Saturday, 2 shows a night, and then on Sunday we would do a free concert in the park. Right, so we'd all, by the time Sunday evening rolled around, we were all pretty wasted, being exhausted and stuff, and we did things like that, and it was just, it was. Then Woodstock happened, and that was a whole nother, thing that all of a sudden, we went from being small theaters around the country, and then became people would go to the Madison Square Garden, to the arenas. So it grew to that, and then it grew to the big outdoor. After Woodstock, it was like, they have all these big outdoor concerts and stuff. And, everybody's trying to look for their Woodstock. They was trying to have, recapture what happened at Woodstock. Well, a Woodstock happens once in a lifetime, in my opinion, just like everything else happens once in a lifetime. And everybody tries to copy off of it.
So that was Bob C. talking a lot about just kind of the evolution of outdoor concerts and venues. And I think it's perfect timing because by the time this podcast is released, we'll have just recently celebrated the 50th anniversary of Woodstock.
Yay.
Yep. I was just checking your math.
Ooh,
yep.
You looked at me like, I was like, what? You're crazy. Like, oh, God.
Well, I was just trying to think what year it was. And I was like, oh, yeah, okay, that makes sense.
So what better way to tie all that, bring it all, full circle and remind us that life is cyclical than hearing Bob C. reflect on that. And I got to see that Mike's dad got to go this weekend.
At the time of this recording, my parents are in Woodstock. Well, they were in Woodstock yesterday.
Yeah, that's cool. Have you talked to your dad? Did he say what it was like 50 years later?
Yeah, well, I mean, he sent pictures and stuff. I haven't gotten the full download of it yet, but I saw the pictures and it's cool. I mean, all of like the historical stuff, and there's a big museum there with
and the markers and historical markers. That's really cool.
Yeah.
So next we're going to kind of transition from Bob C. talking about Woodstock and outdoor festivals to going back to the Fillmore and kind of the end of its life there in New York City. So here's Bob C. talking about really not being able to duplicate the magic that was the Fillmore and its closing.
People tried to copy off what we had at the Fillmore, and they still are today trying to copy it. They'll never get that because that was something that was very rudimentary in the sense of the people were what made it what it was. They're trying today to get the name Fillmore and do this and they think it's going to be, but they're not going to have it because there's too much clouding all of what made it great in those days. You can't repeat that. It's history. That's something you're never going to remake history in that sense. You got to live by it and you should remember what happened, and try to make it better, but you can't. You just got to remember what it was about, and not try to relive it. So it was a very, interesting time in my life. I mean, in my life has been very interesting ever since I got involved in it. I can't think of a time in my life wasn't interesting. For whatever, whether it be good, bad, or indifferent, there was always something new and different going on. And after the Fillmore closed, I ended up, I've been living above the Fillmore in the loft, and I was in charge of stripping the Fillmore down and taking the sound system out and sending it to California to Bill out there because he shut New York down but kept California operating. And we ended up basically stripping the theater of the lights and the sound and so on, and sent it out by semi to California. And that's where I met Patrick, basically, was at that point, Stansfield. And at that point, I went to California, and I, was thinking about maybe moving out there. And they weren't very, there was the East Coast and the West Coast. And the Easties weren't friendly with the Westies. And it's like, they didn't want us coming out there. And, a couple people did move out there and ended up working for Fillmore West or for FM Productions. But I ended up getting a job working for the James Gang, and then after that I came back, and I always came back to New York, it always seemed that I'd always find work, and I ended up doing odd things in New York, and then all of a sudden I got a phone call from David Bowie.
So that was Bob C. once again from his 2010 NAMM Oral History interview. And I love the perspective that he has on the Fillmore. And there's so much been talked about, and it's neat to hear somebody who was actually there. Fantastic stuff. And of course, Bob was a recipient of the Parnelli Lifetime Achievement Award. And I know that there were several other people over the years that we have interviewed that also had that distinction. And I think there's actually a way on the website that you can get to a listing and watch some of those web clips. Is that right, Mike?
Yeah. So if you head over to NAMM.org and head to the library section of the website, and click on Advanced Search. You can search for all of our tags there, and just search for the Parnelli Awards tag, and you'll find everyone associated with the Parnellis and the Lifetime Achievement Award.
And I think if you are on Bob C's web clip, there's also a link to that tag at the bottom of this bio. Is that right?
Correct, yeah.
So there's two ways to get to it.
So as we work our way through this interview with Bob C., we've just kind of talked about the Fillmore closing and ending that big chapter in Bob's life. You can really feel from him the tie he had to that building, that venue. I mean, it's like, I feel like when I was listening to it and watching the interview, that it's almost like he sees the Fillmore almost like as a child, you know what I mean? And he's watched it grow up, and now it's no longer in his life. And so he's got to figure out what to do next, which is the perfect transition to the next section. And we're going to be hearing about life after the Fillmore for Bob C., the work he was doing, who he's getting to tour with and be recruited by, as well as starting his own business.
From then, I worked for Bowie for 5 or 6 tours and went, around the world with him, and came back and went to work with other bands, English bands, and basically started my own company, C Factor. And I built it little at a time, little at a time. We were in the beginning down on we used the Fillmore building for a little while, and then we had storefronts on 3 different blocks: 5th Street, 6th Street, and 7th Street. So when we had some of the gear in one building and we worked on the street assembling equipment, and the meter maid came along and said, you're consuming parking spaces, you have to pay for the parking. So we ended up putting dimes in the parking meters to keep her happy, so she wouldn't issue a ticket to us. And, we built shows, and eventually I had a couple of guys who worked with me at the Fillmore who'd go out, and I designed the show, and they'd go out and run it. I'd go out for a couple of days, and they'd run it, and I'd come back and be looking for the next tour to do. And it just, it evolved, and we moved down from that. Just got too nuts to try to do things like that. And we moved downtown to Thomas Street, and I got a loft building down there where I had the ground floor, the basement, and the 4th floor, I think it was, for our gear. And then I ended up getting another part of the building. And again, it grew, and it was just too crazy. We keep equipment in semis, and part of the semis either right there in the street on Thomas Street, and when they want to give us tickets, the drivers would drive the semis around the block until the guys would go around and leave us alone, and then they'd repark the thing. And it was just, again, it was nuts. It was always a challenge. How are we going to do this? And I can't remember not working 18-hour days at least 7 days a week, And eventually this is ridiculous. I can't keep working out of Lower Manhattan. Because Lower Manhattan below Houston Street, where we were, became very hip, very, trendy. It was going the way that it had gone between Houston and Canal, right? And we were below Canal, actually. And so it became very, it started to become very hip. The artists started to move in, and when we were there originally, it was industrial, and it was like it was nothing. It was we didn't have a grocery store. We went to New Jersey to buy our groceries and brought them back, And I ended up, my wife and I ended up having a child, and after that, she said, we can't keep living here. We got to figure out what we're going to do. So I ended up rented a house out here in Queens, and then my son lived out here, and I'd drive back and forth. And I said, this is too nuts. I can't keep doing this. So eventually I found this place in Long Island City, and I, bit my nails, and I signed on the dotted line, and I've been here ever since, and, turning tours out. And as the business evolved and changed, we had to change. So the touring business fell off for quite some time. And we got into other things. We did a lot of local events, and eventually we got into film and television, and we started doing a lot of that, and eventually out here became the Hollywood of the East Coast. The Hollywood, because Astoria Studios is right down the street here. Silver Cup and Steiner across the river in Brooklyn, and it became, and all the movie stars like to live in New York or nearby it, and you can't get the same scene that you can in New York. Toronto doesn't do it, so when they want a New York street scene, they got to come to New York, and they do. And New York has made its tax incentives to keep them here, and so this is where our business is developed, and we still do some touring, but not that much. It's not our direction changed over the years, and it became when the moving light came into existence, it basically pushed a lot of the other kinds of companies out of business, and we didn't have Vera lights like Shoko did, and so we just evolved to stay alive, because otherwise we'd die and go away, and I wasn't going to do that. So I've always been a survivor, so I'll keep surviving. And that's where we are today. I mean, basically,
it's amazing. I love reading about the stuff that you do. You guys are very active in all kinds of stuff, and one of the things I was sort of curious about is back to the David Bowie days, doing that tour. Do you look back at that and think that any of that stuff that you were doing, the lighting or any of that, was innovative at the time? Oh yeah, we were doing. We tried to do. Bowie always had crazy ideas about doing stuff, and they didn't have the money, and the budgets weren't the way they are today. They didn't want to spend giant gobs of money because a lot of the things in the infrastructure that exists now, the buses, the trucks, the companies, all the things that go on today because they developed out of the need. But back when I was doing Bowie, right in the early 70s, there was a need, but there wasn't no one stepped up to the plate. A lot of the Shoko and myself and other companies that were big enough got into their own trucking. Nowadays, you don't bother because you hire a trucking company because there's 7 or 10 of them out there to do it. I mean, when I started and put together C Factor, there were maybe 5 other companies in the world that did what I did. All right? There really were very few that toured the world, I'm talking about. When we started, we had an operation in London, for 20-some-odd years. We had an operation in L.A. for about the same time. And it got to the point where I was running around, becoming a jet setter with, between going to Los Angeles and then trying to also keep New York running. Because New York was the hub, and L.A. and the UK were really satellites. They did some business on their own, but the company, we weren't big enough to be able to have major operations in both locations, in all 3 locations. So we ended up shipping equipment.
I mean, it's hard to imagine being at a point in your career where you get a call from David Bowie and it's
right?
like, hey, come work for me. I mean, can you say no to that? I don't.
No, you can't. So what's really cool about Bob is the story he tells about just starting his own company. He figured out there was a need, and he knew he had a little area of expertise, and so he just went for it. And he was very sort of shy or sort of somewhat humble about some of the contributions that he made, and I had to kind of drag some of it out of him. But I really think that it was awesome that we documented that, because so many people now involved with the Parnellis and other aspects of the live sound have sent emails regarding our interview with him saying how wonderful it was to have that perspective documented. And so we're going to hear more of that perspective coming up. What is he going to cover next?
Next up, Bob's going to be talking more about touring, more specifically with Neil Diamond and Rush, and just seeing the world while on tour and the great experiences that he had.
The bands also want, like Rush, we did them for 20-some-odd years. They want the same show on each, So we'd have certain stuff that we had in London that we could use, and then we ship the rest. The same thing for Neil Diamond. Neil Diamond shipped everything, everything. I remember we did a show in Atlantic City, drove up to the airport here in JFK, load a 747 with 27 pallets. I mean, Patrick can tell this story, but 20-some odd pallets of, and it flew to London, and we ended up doing a show in London. That was the only way we get to gear there fast enough. We did a Roger Waters show. Same thing, where we ended up FedExing everything, literally FedExing everything to London. And it's just it's a crazy world. And the things we used to do, because the way the booking was done or whatever the reasons were, we always had to find a way around it all. How to make it happen. And yeah, it was interesting from the standpoint of designing and doing things and making changes and I don't know, just coming up with solutions. There was always a problem, or they needed to have a solution to something, and that was the fun part of it: solving problems. And the excitement of it. I mean, how often do you get to hang out in the airport and load a 747, or end up flying on the Concorde, or just doing things that you tell your kids, and they kind of look at you like, did you? They can't imagine some of the things you did, working for Aerosmith for all the years we worked for them. I mean, we worked with, I would say, 90% of all of the major artists that existed for all those years, the 70s and the 80s, and it was just, it was fun. I mean, I sit here and I think back, and I say to myself, Jesus, I've been in this business now for almost 40 plus years. And it's like 40 years? I can't imagine being here doing all the things I've done. I'm still here. It's a thing I don't understand, on some levels. But it's been a fun ride. I mean, they used to say, join the Navy and see the world. Well, I changed it to go on the road with a rock band and see the world, because, you become a family and everybody goes, together, and you go all over the world and you do what you have to do. And it's like, the first time I went to Japan, it was like, we didn't take any gear over. We just went over ourselves, and we hired all the gear over there because they didn't want to pay for the shipping. And actually, I think the first time I went over there, we did ship some stuff over. But then all of a sudden, the Japanese figured out how to do it. And after the first 2 shows, all their little guys would figure out, how to hang the whole show. And it would be up, and it would be what you want. And all you do is stand there and call it, and they'd have an interpreter that would, and then I had to learn how to say, the different colors in Japanese or in Spanish, or whatever language of the locals. And then there'd be an interpreter to say, or I'd say, follow Bowie, or someone's, it was like, that's, but that was the fun of it too, and I got off the road because I started to have a family, and I just didn't want to travel, the amount of traveling. And I had seen almost everything I wanted to see at that point. I'd been almost everywhere I wanted to be or go. And I figured, when I retire, I'll go and finally go to see all these places again, and enjoy them. But I haven't retired yet, and I don't know if I'll ever retire. So, who knows, we go from there.
So that was Bob talking about life after the Fillmore, going on tour with different groups, and kind of that unique perspective of having all your equipment shipped from location to location as opposed to trucking it all yourself. And now we're going to hear Bob talking about major innovations throughout his career and the changes he witnessed.
Yeah. I was going to ask you about what you think to be some of the major innovations during your career. I mean, you mentioned the moving lights. That must have been a huge one.
Oh, yeah. The first time the Vera lights were seen out on a tour, everyone went, and it was something new and different. And a lot of companies tried to build their own Vera light or look-alike, and a lot of people went through a lot of money trying to, and some of them were successful. And then it became, it got very political. I'd say in the 60s and the 70s were fun. The 80s and the 90s became a political mess, or got very political, as it is in the 2000s. I mean, and it was equipment, but then as the Chinese and as the manufacturers became, like someone. The interesting thing is, way back in the beginning, we had to build everything. That's why I did with C Factor, because I couldn't go down the street, go to the truss store down the street and buy a truss. I had to build my own truss. I needed a dimmer rack. I couldn't go down the street and buy a dimmer rack. I had to buy dimmers and build a rack, right? And this is something that people don't understand. A lot of the stuff that we did in the beginning was, there wasn't a catalog. You thumb through and say, gee, I'll have 6 of those and 5 of those. And then you go to another catalog and find motors or trussing or whatever. I mean, chain hoist motors were found, but were used in total other applications. And you'd find equipment that was used in other applications that you could apply to our needs, right? And I mean, the par can, it originally started out as a headlight for a car, I mean, all kinds of innovations that occurred over the years where someone would take a specific thing and maybe make it better. But you'd also, a lot of the companies would make things where you only had this type of particular connector from multi-core or whatever it would be, and it would be your little niche. And people would use that as a selling point. And then if you wanted to bid on somebody, the designer or whoever was in charge, you'd say, well, we want everything with Litton connectors or with this or with that. And, there'd be their way of getting the work to where they want and still, quote unquote, have, people, more than one person bid on it. But also a lot of things I did because I had to. I mean, we used to do bundles of cable for years and make up cables designed specifically for each tour. Then it got multi-core, and then we're still with multi-core as a solution. And moving lights with Verilight, and you couldn't buy moving lights, right? And Verilight was the big guy. There were a couple other people who got in designing moving lights, but Verilight was the primo moving light. I mean, they were a huge company for a long period of time. And what would happen is you'd have to be friends with them, or else you might get knocked off the tour, or it might be an all Verilight tour, and all you provided was the trussing and the rigging and stuff. Then they became rigging companies. That's all they did. So I had to look and say, okay, again, how am I going to prevent being put out of business? So I had to find something else to use my skills in, and find someplace else that needed what we could do. All right, and that's why I moved to the movie. It's also why we did a lot of local jobs, and where they weren't going to hire a company from Dallas or from Toronto because they had somebody who could do it right here. So we were able to do it. But again, the big changes happened from what we used was a stick of lights with some lights on it, and then we went to genie hoist that you had an air thing that pumped it up, and then we went to lifts, sumner lifts or vent lifts or whatever to lift up a truss, and then we put the truss up in the air with motors, got rid of the ground support. Then we moved to adding moving lights, so then some of the lights got thrown off, and then more and more moving lights got added, and then eventually it became all moving lights. And I said to Rusty Boucher, who was the president of Verilights, at one time at some show we were at, what was it, some lighting show, I don't remember what it was. This was years and years ago. I said, eventually within 10 years, every light will twist and turn, change color, zoom in, and there will be no need for static lights anymore. And he kind of looked at me and smiled, yeah. Then other companies got into it, like Martin, and there's a couple other companies, an Italian company, and then the Japanese got it, and then now the Chinese are into it, and they all take and copy everything that somebody else comes out with. So it's like the automobile business used to be.
Once again, you are listening to the NAMM interview with Bob C. recorded in 2010. And one of the innovations that he didn't talk about in great detail that he gets a lot of credit for is the simple procedure of packing the truck. You know, when going from gig to gig, it really does make a big difference how you load and unload the equipment and gear. And Bob was really a master at that. And so his legacy certainly continues with those who have studied the craft of loading and unloading trucks. And it's really kind of neat to hear that just kind of a simple thing, it seems, is actually takes a lot of effort and a lot of studying. So kind of cool to recognize that element, not only of his career, but of the many people who continue to do that now.
So moving on, we're going to hear Bob talk about a variety of topics, such as lighting shows, developing products, him wanting to tour as opposed to manufacture, and some innovation that was going on, as well as the industry maturing and his opinions on lighting versus sound.
You go to a trade show, a lighting and sound trade show for our business. Today, it's like going to a car show 20 years ago. And there's so much glitz. And so you walk in and it's like there's lighting, everything's moving this, da, 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 da. And it's just like going to an auto show now. You know, I mean, today's lighting and sound shows like LDI or whatever they may be, right? They're like going to an auto show 20 years ago. You know, I'm surprised they don't have girls in swimsuits sitting on top of the truss and saying, you should buy Tom's truss versus so-and-so's truss or whatever. You know, I mean, it's the same thing. And again, you know, it's like, how many different ways can you do a truss? I mean, you know, and that's why I've tried to, over the years, keep the relationships with particular companies, you know, tight, because I didn't want to move around and only get the cheapest or whatever. I mean, it's, you know, there's certain people who develop, like Thomas Trussing. And again, we used to build our own trussing for years, and we built it for other people. And I said, I don't want to become a truss manufacturer. My thing was touring, and I wanted to tour or do shows or whatever. And I didn't want to become a manufacturer. I was at various times for myself, you know, where we'd make cable, we built dimmer racks, and we'd buy somebody else's dimmer and package it. Buy consoles. We designed our consoles for a long time. We designed our own moving light console. Because at one point, there were no moving light consoles. So we designed a thing called a Taskmaster, which ended up where what we did was make a console that could control any moving light that was out. All we needed was the protocol. And because at that point, there was no console. So you'd have this kind of moving light from this manufacturer and this kind of moving light from this manufacturer. But they each had to have their own consoles. So we designed a console. And we sold a few of them, but mainly it kept us in the loop for about 10 or 15 years where we had our own console, right? And we could run anybody's lights. So if somebody said, I want to use such and such, fine. We could run them in or buy them or whatever we wanted to do. And we could run them on our consoles. And then all of a sudden, other people picked up on the idea, and boom, you know, there were all kinds of consoles out there that would do anything, you know. And I didn't feel like becoming a console manufacturer. So, you know, that's how things changed. I mean, there were every few years there was a definite major improvement or change in the industry. You know, from getting dimmers and dimmer racks, touring, multi-core, moving lights, more moving lights, and then more moving lights, you know. It's like, and then certain tours would want to have very specialized things designed for them. You know, the Stones was one of the people who always had a very special look because the design people wanted to have certain looks, or that's how they sold it to the Stones, and that's what the Stones sold to the public, you know. It was a whole show, you know, not just a bunch of lights and some musicians standing there and playing guitars or running around stage. And that's the way it was with a lot of bands. And it depended the type of production that they surrounded themselves with, how much money they had, and how big an ego they had, and how much money they were willing to throw at their ego to give them, you know. It was like Van Halen, you know, at one point, you just say they had more lights out than anybody else. They had like 1,500 lights out on a tour. And then it became, okay, how many trucks and this and that. and you got production people involved, and like Michael Ahern would, in the early days, figured out he ran it like a military situation with the Stones, where he had the A team and the B team, and they would jump each other and be two sets of equipment. I mean, it was nuts, all right, on some touring stuff, and and then you had roofs that moved and this so that the show could be. I mean, it was just one thing after another, and you ended up having people who would break off and specialize in certain areas. So nowadays, if I was given $1 million or $2 million, I can sit down and put together almost anything anybody wants for a tour, and not have to build single thing for myself, because you can buy it all. Because there's a guy who makes cable, there's a guy who makes dimmers, there's a guy who makes moving lights, there's 20 guys who makes moving lights, and then there's a guy who makes truss, or 10 people who make truss. So you can buy almost anything you want, and if you think this technology is better, you can buy it. You don't need to, exercise your brain to create it anymore, because people have designed it. And then, the bean counters got involved, the accountants, and everything had to be done. So then it got to the point where, okay, you can't spend the money you used to spend, So then it was how do you do what they want and make every show look a little different, but do it so that the bean counters don't get upset, so that you give the bean counters what they want, which is more money for the bands. So, it just goes on and on and on. And I'm sure it'll continue to go on after I'm dead. So, and it doesn't change. It's just that we've matured now as an industry. I'm not sure if we have, but we supposedly have. A lot of people out there would like to think we have. And I guess in a way we have. We've had our problems in any other industry, but we're not like Toyota. We don't have problems with the brakes or the engines or whatever, And it's interesting that now, because of the big oil spill, Letterman is making jokes about, boy, now Toyota doesn't have to worry. They can get out of the hot seat. They put the BP in it instead. And they had a little skit about that the other night. It's very interesting. So that's exactly what's going on. And that applies to our business as well. Sound. The sound systems, and we got involved in sound 25, 30 years ago, I guess, when a sound company said and got involved with lighting, and then all of a sudden said to the artist, oh, I'll do sound for $12,500 and give you lights for $2,500. Well, that's what we did with lights. Well, we had to get into sound, so we did the same thing. We said, okay, we'll do your lights, and we'll do your sound, and we'll do it for this amount of money, And then the package deals happen. Oh, you want trucking? Okay, fine. We'll give the trucking. And it was all for the bottom line. It all came down to, your profit margins went down, but you did more. Okay, so it means that you made more money? No, it means you spent more money, and you had to have profit on, and it got pretty crazy, and it still is. So, I don't know where it's going to all go. It's now there's a couple of very big people who do a lot of the big things, and a lot of little regional companies. And, I don't know if the big guys are going to survive, because a lot of the artists don't want or aren't happy with what they're getting, So who knows? Who knows what's going to happen. So we'll see.
Well, I know you do lighting and sound. Do you prefer one over the other at this point?
No, I just prefer to get paid good for both of them, or the amount I should be paid for both of them, which doesn't happen. You're always giving something for something else. There's always a trade-off, no matter what it is, because people figure, oh well, I'm giving you all this business, you should make it so I make less money. So that they pay less, and in turn I make less. So. But your exposure is greater, and it's like you gotta have insurance, and it all. And when you work out of New York or Los Angeles, it's major metropolitan areas. Things always cost more. Our mayor likes to hit us with taxes I don't even know about. And that's why, like, we're the only company. There used to be 5 companies or 3 companies in New York City area, right? I think we're the only ones now that are still here that do what we do. I mean, and we can do anything. That's the thing. We can do big shows at Central Park, or we can do little things in nightclubs. We can do anything. And that's our big across the board spectrum of what we can do.
So that was Bob kind of touching on a variety of subjects there, and we're going to move into the conclusion of this interview with him, and we're going to be hearing him talking about providing some examples of shows that had their hiccups, which I think is a good way to put it. Just some of the challenges along the way.
Issues.
Yeah.
Yeah, a little brain teaser for you. As well as we're going to hear him reflect on Bill Graham once again, as we heard previously, and his philosophy of trying to solve problems before they become a problem.
One more thing I wanted to ask you about. I can sit here and listen to you all day. This is just great to hear your career and your thoughts. But I also know that you're quite the thinker, and when push comes to shove, if there's an incident, and almost every show has one, where something doesn't quite work, you found some amazing and unique ways of getting around. I wonder if you have any favorite anecdotes or stories about that.
Oh, God. That's a hard one to answer because in the early days, there was always things to think around, right? Today, it's not so much. I mean, yeah, it's like you go in and somebody says, well, I want to hang this TV screen here in this beer garden or wherever, and it weighs, 2 tons. Well, okay, you set up this, do that, and put this together and you hang it, right? But that's all built out of building blocks. I mean, what we have done, or I think what I have done, is I've helped the industry create a lot of building blocks. I mean, yeah, there's a lot of things that were copied that we designed, and other people took and went on and made that part of their product line. Like box truss, like folding truss. Those are all things that we did that nobody else did way back in the early years. Multi-cable, yeah, there were companies that had multi-cable, but we went to Pound National, which Pound National cable is the best, and you drive over with a forklift, it doesn't break it, and things like that. And they were more expensive, and so people found cheaper solutions. And those manufacturers, because they got so much business, became a better connector. Wire, certain wire became, and then we also had groups of people who made industry standards that for years we met here, I think one week a year, like a Tuesday. I think that was one Tuesday night every month. I think first Tuesday every month for a year or two. We met here, after 7 and had discussions about how to change the electrical code, and we tried to, and as all these things have grown out, like ESTA has become a group of industry people. And everybody who's in the industry really basically joins. And it's our society now. We're joining together with the same people, Plaza, over in England, who do England. And, so what we're trying to do is prevent government regulation. We're also trying to prevent accidents. We've had accidents over the years. But, knock on wood, as an industry whole, we've had very few of them where people got killed. And that's an amazing thing for what we've done. Think about the fact that I went to an Aerosmith show one day at the Garden. I looked up it, and there was 40,000 pounds of equipment flying over Steven Tyler's head. And I just sat there and I said my prayer that nothing would ever happen. And my prayer was the fact that I always tried to do it the right way. Don't shortcut, because all it's going to do is kick you in the ass. And somebody's going to get hurt. And I'd rather waste $1 to making sure that doesn't happen than to try to save $1 to make my pocket richer. And that's the way I've always been. And I've always tried, never lie. Always tell the truth. There was a production, I won't name names, but that went across the country that ended up they'd say, well, how much does the system weigh? And they lied by, 50,000 pounds. They almost pulled down roofs. And, and it's because you can't do that. You got to know what's going on. And it's got to be done the right way. And I think that's one of the things in the early days I strived for. And I still strive for it. And, when people call me and ask me, what I think, and I tell them, and they know I'm going to tell them what I feel and what I think, because I've never hid my feelings about things. And if I think that someone's an ass, I tell them they're an ass, or I think that that this idea is okay, but or that it's stupid or whatever, and you try to be honest about what and where you're going, because if you're not, it's too difficult to keep track of what you've said. If it isn't in your heart and in your head, then you say it the way you believe in it, because that way it'll be the same thing 5 years later. And that was one of the things I liked about Bill Graham. I think that when Graham died, the heart of our industry got lost, all right? Because he made demands on production in his day that I don't think anybody ever made afterwards, all right? On shows that he would even comment about shows that came in, and he thought that, he goes, he said, oh, it's just too much or whatever. And and he was really very straight shooting about that kind of stuff. And you learn a lot from the people you work with and for, and that's what I've tried to always do, is you take and get rid of what you don't want to or don't believe in, and you develop your own ideas off of others, as well as your own thinking, or what you see or what you believe, or you ask questions, or you see, and you always try to find the problem before the problem happens. I think that all of the problems that have arisen, I believe that people have always tried to come up with solutions beforehand. They recognize the fact there might be a problem and try to solve it beforehand so it doesn't happen. I mean, I don't know if that's totally true, but that's kind of the way I try to live my professional life. So,
well said. I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
This is great stuff. I could stay here all afternoon, but I know you got other stuff to do, so thank you.
Well, we'll do it another time if you like.
Part 2.
So that wraps our Bob C. interview. Mostly Dan, Dan, do you have any final thoughts you want to interject about Bob, of things you didn't get to mention earlier?
Well, I think I did mention what an honor it was to have some time with him. I learned a lot from him, and I'm really very hopeful that other people can learn from this interview, because that's sort of the point of the collection, and certainly would be an extra bonus for the fact that his legacy will continue. And also a hats off to all those involved with the Parnelli Awards. It's awesome to have you part of the NAMM family, and we are looking forward to interviewing more of their Lifetime Achievement winners.
Yeah, and if you're ever at a NAMM show and have the opportunity to attend a Parnelli Awards, I definitely recommend it. Last year was my first time going, and it's just cool to see all the people that make these shows and tours happen, because you'll always see the award shows for the main guy on stage, but you'll never see the people behind the scenes. So it's just really cool to see that side of the industry.
Well said, Mike.
And from what I hear, they throw one heck of a party.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun too.
It is fun. Great people.
So that concludes our episode all about Bob C., and we want to thank you guys for listening once again. Unfortunately, we will be moving on with this podcast without Elizabeth. She's moving on to bigger and better things, and
not better, but
we're going to miss you.
Yeah, we're going to miss her a lot. She's helped this podcast grow. It was basically her idea to start it, and it won't be the same, but hopefully it will still be okay, and you guys will still listen.
Yeah, I've enjoyed working with you guys, and I'm going to miss our roundtable discussions and all the laughing and all the craziness that ensued making this podcast.
It'll be hard to continue without you, because you were really the inspiration for this program starting. If it wasn't for you taking the head and lead on this, I don't think I would have been involved. So it really is a sad moment for us. But we will continue, because that's what show business does.
So thanks, everyone, for listening for the past year and a half, 2 years. We're excited to keep going, and we hope that you stick around with us.
Thanks, Elizabeth.
Bye forever.
Bye-bye.
Bye.